The first time I saw my new house, nestled on the outskirts of a small town in Ohio, my emotions were a mix of hope and hesitation. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to escape the wreckage of my old life, a failed marriage, and the endless struggle to piece myself back together. The house wasn't anything fancy, but it had a charm that hinted at the promise of something new. Its peeling paint and weathered shutters seemed to whisper, "We've seen some stories. Now it's your turn to create one." The first few days were spent in a whirlwind of unpacking boxes, sweeping up cobwebs, and trying to make the space feel like home. Despite my best efforts, though, the emptiness of the house seemed to amplify the loneliness that had followed me here. On the third evening, I found myself sitting on the front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, when the crunch of gravel footsteps broke through my thoughts. I turned, startled, to see an older man approaching. He carried a toolbox in one hand, and his face was lit with a kind, reserved smile. "Evening, ma'am. You must be my new neighbor," he said, tipping his head in greeting. "I'm Jonathan. I live right across the street." "Hi," I replied, still slightly caught off guard. "Yes, I just moved in." "I'm Sarah." His gaze drifted to the disassembled bookshelf leaning against the porch railing, a project I had spent hours failing to complete. "Looks like you could use a hand," he remarked with a hint of humor. I chuckled awkwardly. "You caught me. I'm not exactly handy when it comes to stuff like this." "Well," he said with a grin, "how about I stop by tomorrow and help you out? I've got tools and a bit of experience with this sort of thing." At first, I hesitated. It felt strange to accept help from someone I'd just met. But there was something about his offer, so genuine and simple, that made it hard to say no. I thanked him and agreed. True to his word, Jonathan showed up the next morning, carrying more tools than seemed necessary for such a small project. He got right to work, telling me stories as he tightened screws and adjusted shelves. He talked about his years as a history teacher, his passion for gardening, and his life since retiring. "Keeping busy helps," he said, his hands steady as he worked. "When your hands are occupied, it's easier to quiet your mind." I nodded, feeling a connection to his words. By the time the bookshelf was finally standing upright, I had learned more about Jonathan than I expected to. He'd lost his wife 5 years ago, and though he mentioned it briefly, his voice carried a quiet grief that lingered between the lines of his sentences. "Thank you, Jonathan," I said, running my fingers along the smooth edge of the finished bookshelf. "You have no idea how much this means to me." He smiled softly, brushing off the gratitude like it was no big deal. "It's nothing, Sarah. Sometimes it just feels good to help." That evening, as I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, I found myself replaying our conversation. His kindness had caught me off guard in the best way possible. In the span of a single day, he had made me feel less like a stranger and more like I belonged. I didn't know it then, but Jonathan wasn't just another neighbor. He was someone who would challenge my solitude, teaching me that even after the most difficult chapters of our lives, there's always a chance to begin again. The weeks that followed Jonathan's visit flew by in a blur of cleaning, organizing, and trying to breathe life into my new home. The once chaotic piles of moving boxes had slowly dwindled, leaving behind a semblance of order. But even with a routine beginning to take shape, the evenings still felt lonely. The house, despite all my efforts, didn't quite feel like mine yet. One quiet morning, in an attempt to distract myself, I decided to bake a pie. Baking had always been therapeutic for me. The careful measuring, the rhythm of rolling out dough, the warmth of the oven. This time, it was a simple apple pie, fragrant with cinnamon and nutmeg, a taste of comfort and familiarity. As the pie cooled on the counter, I thought of Jonathan. His unexpected kindness had stuck with me, and I figured a slice of homemade pie would be the perfect way to thank him. I wrapped the pie in a clean kitchen towel and crossed the street. Jonathan's house looked as welcoming as he did, a cozy front porch with 2 wooden rocking chairs, a small table, and pots of bright flowers in full bloom. I knocked on the door, and before long, he appeared, looking pleasantly surprised. "Well, this is a nice surprise," he said, his warm smile deepening. "What's that you've got there?" "A thank you pie," I said, handing it over. for all your help with the bookshelf. I hope you like apple. Apple's my favorite, he said, stepping aside to invite me in. Come on in, let's have a slice together. Jonathan's home felt lived in and cozy, filled with little details that told his story. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents a mix of history, mystery, and gardening guides. A plaid throw draped over an armchair in the corner, and photos adorned the walls, some of him, others of his late wife. The air carried the faint scent of wood polish and the fresh-cut flowers on the dining table. We took our seats on his porch, each with a generous slice of pie and a cup of tea he'd brewed. Jonathan took his first bite, closed his eyes for a moment, and then gave a dramatic nod. Now this, he said, grinning, is the best pie I've had in years. You've set the bar high, Sarah. I laughed, feeling a flicker of pride. Well, if you ever need another one, I might ask you to fix my kitchen sink or paint the fence, I teased. That's a deal I'd take any day, he said with a chuckle. The conversation flowed easily, and I learned more about him. He spoke of his wife, Ellen, and their travels before her illness kept them closer to home. He mentioned the quietness of the house after she passed, how he'd thrown himself into gardening and woodworking to keep the silence at bay. She was an amazing woman, he said softly, looking out at the street. It's strange how the little things like a smell or a sound can bring back memories when you least expect it. I nodded, sensing the weight of his words. Grief is strange like that, I offered quietly. It doesn't go away, but it changes. At least, that's what I'm learning. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, we sat in a shared understanding that didn't need words. Eventually, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. He asked about my work, my favorite books, and what had brought me to this quiet town. I told him bits and pieces of my story, leaving out the rawest details of my divorce, but sharing enough for him to understand why I needed a fresh start. As the sun dipped lower, painting the porch in warm, golden light, I realized how comfortable I felt. It had been a long time since I'd laughed like this, since I'd allowed myself to feel at ease in someone else's company. When it was time to leave, Jonathan stood by the door, holding the empty pie plate. Thank you, Sarah, he said, his voice warm and genuine. You didn't just bring me a pie, you made my day. Right back at you, Jonathan, I replied. As I walked back across the street, I felt a little lighter. It was just a pie, just a conversation. But somehow, it felt like a step forward, a reminder that even small gestures could begin to fill the emptiness. The weeks rolled on, and my new life began to take shape. Mornings were spent working at my laptop, afternoons tending to the neglected garden that sprawled behind the house. Jonathan, my ever-thoughtful neighbor, often stopped by to chat or offer a helping hand. But one day, he came with a proposal that I couldn't resist. Sarah, he called out from across the fence, leaning on it casually. How do you feel about autumn festivals? There's one downtown this weekend, apple cider, pumpkin pie, and all kinds of little crafts. It's one of the best parts of living here. I hadn't been to a festival in years, not since I was a child. The idea of crisp air, warm cider, and the energy of a bustling market felt like exactly what I needed. I think I'd love that, I replied with a smile. Saturday arrived with the kind of cool, sunny weather that seemed designed for fall festivities. I threw on my favorite wool sweater and a pair of sturdy boots, eager to embrace the season. Jonathan picked me up in his old but impeccably clean truck, and as we drove into town, the faint scent of pine and falling leaves filled the air. When we arrived, the festival was alive with activity. Rows of vendor booths stretched across the town square, displaying everything from handmade jewelry to jars of honey. The smells of freshly baked bread and roasted nuts wafted through the air, mingling with the cheerful sounds of a local band playing upbeat folk tunes. We wandered through the booths, sampling baked goods and sipping steaming cups of apple cider that Jonathan had promised would be the best I'd ever taste. He was right. Its perfect blend of sweetness and spice warmed me from the inside out. I told you, he said with a triumphant grin as I sipped. We stopped by a woodcarver stand, where an elderly man demonstrated his craft, carving intricate animals from blocks of wood. Jonathan picked up a small wooden owl and examined it with a thoughtful expression. It's perfect, he said, handing it to the vendor. For your collection? I teased. No, he replied, shaking his head. For your garden. It'll look great hanging from one of the trees. His simple, thoughtful gesture left me momentarily speechless. It wasn't extravagant, but it was so genuine, so Jonathan. We continued exploring the festival, laughing at a street magician's tricks and attempting, unsuccessfully in my case, to win prizes at the ring toss. Jonathan, however, proved to be far more skilled and won me a small plush pumpkin. Here, he said, handing it to me with a playful smirk. A lucky charm for your new life. As the afternoon stretched on, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting the town square in a warm, golden glow. We stopped at a booth selling antique books and trinkets. Jonathan lingered over an old picture frame, his expression softening as he studied it. It's just like the one I used to keep Ellen's photo in, he said quietly. The mention of his late wife brought a moment of stillness between us. I hesitated, unsure if I should say something or let the moment pass. Are you okay? I asked gently. He gave a small nod, his gaze still fixed on the frame. Memories have a way of sneaking up on you, he said. But that's not always a bad thing. They remind you of what was good. I touched his arm lightly, hoping to offer comfort. Then let's make today one of those good memories, I said. He smiled, and the weight of the moment seemed to lift. As the festival wound down, we returned to the truck, carrying our small treasures and the warmth of a perfect autumn day. On the drive home, Jonathan turned to me and said, "Thank you for coming today, Sarah. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed something like this." Me too, I replied, glancing out the window at the fading light. When we reached my house, Jonathan walked me to the door, the little wooden owl tucked under my arm. "Good night, Sarah," he said. "And thanks for more than just the company." "Good night, Jonathan," I said, watching as he disappeared into the evening shadows. Later that night, I hung the owl on a branch of the old oak tree in my garden. Looking at it, I couldn't help but feel that today had been more than just a day at a festival. It had been a reminder that even in the simplest moments, there's room for joy, connection, and a little hope. After the autumn festival, something shifted. Jonathan and I had found an easy rhythm, a friendship that felt both natural and deeply comforting. Yet, beneath the surface, I began to sense the weight of unspoken questions. How long could we keep going like this? What were we really building between us? These thoughts lingered in the back of my mind, and I suspected they haunted Jonathan too. One evening, I decided to invite him over for dinner. Nothing extravagant, just roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and some warm rolls fresh out of the oven. It was my way of saying thank you, not just for his kindness, but for being a steady presence during a time when I needed it most. Jonathan arrived with his usual thoughtfulness, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that looked like they'd been gathered on a whim. "They're beautiful," I said, smiling as I took them. "Not as beautiful as your cooking smells," he teased, stepping inside. We shared a simple meal in the cozy glow of the dining room, the conversation flowing as easily as ever. We talked about the weather, the upcoming holidays, and his plans to fix a leaky garden hose. But as the evening wore on, the mood shifted. The silences between topics grew heavier, charged with something neither of us wanted to acknowledge. After clearing the dishes, I suggested we sit on the porch. The air was crisp, and the stars above seemed impossibly bright. We settled into the rocking chairs, letting the night wrap around us. For a while, neither of us spoke, the creak of the chairs filling the quiet. Finally, Jonathan broke the silence. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft but steady. "These last few months with you have been unexpected. In a good way. You've reminded me what it feels like to connect with someone again." I turned to him, my chest tightening. "Jonathan," I said, barely above a whisper. "I feel the same. You've been such an important part of this new chapter for me. But I think we both know there's more to this." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "When Ellen passed," he said, "I thought that part of my life was over. I never imagined I'd find myself here, sitting with someone like you, feeling something again. but I don't want to overstep or make this into something it shouldn't be. His honesty struck me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I think we've both been afraid to define what this is, I said. But maybe that's okay. Maybe what we've shared was exactly what we needed for now. Jonathan looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. You've helped me more than I can say, Sarah. But maybe you're right. Maybe this was about reminding ourselves that we're still capable of moving forward. The unspoken agreement hung between us. Neither of us wanted to let go, but we both understood that clinging too tightly could undo the quiet beauty of what we'd built. As the night deepened, we sat together in the stillness, the unspoken goodbye lingering in the cool air. Eventually, Jonathan rose to leave. Thank you, he said, his voice soft. For everything. Thank you too, I replied, watching as he walked down the steps and into the shadows. When I was alone again, I felt the ache of his absence, but also a strange sense of peace. What we had wasn't about loss or regret. It was about finding light in unexpected places, even if only for a short time. The next morning, I looked out at the wooden owl hanging on the branch of my garden tree. It swayed gently in the breeze, a small reminder of everything Jonathan had brought into my life. It wasn't just about him. It was about the hope he'd helped me rediscover, the belief that even after the hardest chapters, there's always room for something new. People come into our lives for reasons we don't always understand. Sometimes they stay, and sometimes they don't. But their presence, no matter how brief, can leave a mark that changes us forever. And that's what Jonathan had been for me, a quiet, steady reminder that even in the simplest of connections, there's power, healing, and the chance to start again.